In the history of criminology, some mysteries refuse to fade away with time. For over 3 decades, a veil of uncertainty has shrouded a set of chilling cases, leaving families, investigators, and the public haunted by unanswered questions. These 3 decades-old cold cases serve as eerie reminders of the enduring power of unsolved mysteries. Let's get into it. Case number 3. Robert Merle Harrod. By 2009, 81-year-old Robert Merle Harrod was looking to take life at a slower pace. He had recently lost his beloved wife, Georgia, after 50 beautiful years of marriage and was preparing for his own inevitability. Whilst Robert drove a modest 1997 gold Toyota Camry, Robert's finances were anything but humble. Some articles speculate he was worth around $5 million thanks to savvy investments and assets. Continuing the modest theme, Robert opted to live at 522 Carnation Drive in Placentia, California, a 3-bed, 3-bath home perfect for raising a family. However, of course, by 2009, all of Robert's children were now adults and had families of their own. Whilst Robert's life had been filled with sorrow, better days were around the corner. Back in 1950, Robert had met and gotten engaged to a woman named Frontal Heater. The two were wrapped in young love's embrace, but unfortunately, they didn't get their fairy tale ending. Shortly after getting engaged, Robert joined the military and the two went their separate ways. Robert ended up marrying Georgia and Frontal also married someone else. However, even after 60 years, the two couldn't stop thinking about each other. After the pair's spouses had passed, and thanks to the internet and modern technology, Robert was able to connect with his long-lost love, and the spark between the two was undeniable. Facing the fact that neither of them was getting any younger, they threw caution to the wind and married on June 29, 2009, only 6 days after they met in person for the first time in decades. Fendel lived in Missouri at the time of their union, and she had arranged to move in with her new husband. Before we continue, we have a surprise for you. We have made a new channel in which we upload cold mystery cases that will shiver your timbers. Don't miss out, link is in description. In July, Robert and his children began doing up the house and preparing for Fentel's arrival. Robert glowed to his housekeeper about his wife's arrival, and nothing seemed to miss in his life. On the morning of July 27, 2009, Robert's son-in-law arrived at 522 Carnation Drive to help Robert with the house. After a cup of coffee and a little chat, game planning the tasks ahead, Robert's son-in-law left for Home Depot to grab supplies between 11 a.m. and 12 p.m. For a few hours, the son-in-law milled around Home Depot, grabbing the necessary supplies and tools for the jobs at hand. At around 1 p.m., or some sources report closer to 2:30 p.m., the son-in-law returned to Carnation Drive only to find it empty and locked. Robert's housekeeper was also sitting in her car out front, waiting to be let inside. She explained that Robert usually left a hidden key if he was going to go out, but this time there was no key present. The front door was locked and Robert wasn't responding. Luckily, the son-in-law had a key and were able to get the pair in. The housekeeper finished her duties, noting that Robert's bed seemed to be in a state of disarray, something she hadn't seen before. Robert's time in the military had drilled in the necessity for a made bed. Even at 80, it was something he did daily. Nevertheless, she cleaned and left the home that evening. Robert's son-in-law desperately tried to find Robert in the home, fearing that he'd had an accident or a fall, but the house was silent. Robert wasn't responding to his calls, and that is when he rang his wife, Robert's daughter. Eventually, the rest of the family was filled in on the situation, and the Placentia police arrived at Carnation Drive by nightfall. Bizarrely, Robert had apparently left with his wallet and keys, but hadn't taken his beloved gold Toyota Camry or his glasses. His children also mentioned that Robert had bad knees and wasn't able to walk long distances. He also couldn't see a few feet in front of him without his glasses, so it seemed unlikely that he'd just walk out of the house. There are some reports that on the night before Robert disappeared, there was a heated argument between him and his daughter over her mother's estate and about what she was set to receive, although this can't be verified. Robert had planned to put Frontal's name on some of his assets that made up his $5 million estate. When law enforcement learned this information, their ears immediately perked up. Through further digging, they discovered that the transfer of assets had yet to occur, and Robert had disappeared before he had the chance. A week after their father's disappearance on August 7, 2009, 2 of his children filed for conservatorship, which would allow them to seize control of their father's assets. They would later tell law enforcement that they wanted the control to maintain his home, pay his bills, and gather reward money. According to reports, Fentel was staunchly against the conservatorship. contesting the application in court, and she continued her plan to move into 522 Carnation Drive. After she moved in, she changed the locks on the house. A protracted legal battle ensued between Vontel and Robert's children. By 2014, the courts declared Robert deceased and passed control of his estate over to his children. Vontel was subsequently evicted from the home and is now said to be living in Kansas. A bulk of the attention was focused on Robert's money. But where was Robert? And in another bizarre twist, Robert's barber was named as a possible suspect by the Placentia Police Department. His barber, who was a woman several years his junior, had once been Robert's girlfriend or in some sort of romantic relationship. Apparently, throughout their relationship, Robert had lent her over $86,000. The Placentia police naturally looked at her and her husband as suspects, although they claimed that the money had been repaid before Robert's disappearance. The only other suspects in Robert's case are his son-in-law and housekeeper. With differing reports on how long his son-in-law was gone, it's possible he may have had time to attack Robert and dump his body somewhere remote. CCTV footage and receipts prove he did go to Home Depot that day, but it doesn't appear that anyone was able to vouch for what time he returned to 522 Carnation Drive. Placentia police did look into the son-in-law and barber, although neither of them nor anyone in Robert's family has been officially named as a suspect. In 2019, the case was revitalized 10 years after Robert's disappearance when it was announced that 2 people had been arrested in connection with Robert's disappearance and now presumed murder. The pair were eventually released without being charged, and their identities were never made public. Many believe that the barber and her husband were the ones held by police, but no entity has ever confirmed this. The only other conclusion left in Robert's case is that Robert was attacked in his home by a stranger, although this seems unlikely. There have never been any reports that anything valuable was taken from the home. There was no blood or sign of struggle in the home other than the unmade bed. Moreover, the neighbors did not report hearing a disturbance, and despite his age, Robert was not a frail man. The other conclusion is that Robert wandered off. His family did tell investigators that they believed he was in early stages of dementia or Alzheimer's. He had begun forgetting things like phone numbers and addresses, although this could be chalked up to old age. Did Robert wander off? Was he attacked by a stranger who bizarrely had no interest in his valuables? Was he attacked by someone he trusted, perhaps even loved? Robert Morel Herod is described as a white male with gray hair, blue eyes, 5'11", and 140 to 170 pounds. Robert is bald on top with short, thin hair around the sides. He usually wears glasses, but these were left behind. He was last seen wearing white shorts, a white V-neck undershirt, white knee socks, a white belt, a white hat, white Reebok sneakers, a plain gold wedding band, and possibly a Masonic ring with a red stone. Case number 2, Craig King. September 21st, 1982 started like any other for loggers working on land near Highway 25 near Ridgeland, Barron County, Wisconsin. Part of the adjacent land was private property, but that afternoon, one of the loggers crossed the threshold and risked trespassing. While assessing the situation, trying to ascertain what property he was on, around 100 yards from the tree line, the logger spotted a small mound of clothing. The clothing struck him as odd, as the area was private land and mostly deserted. It wasn't near any roads or junctions, and it gave him an uneasy feeling. The logger got the attention of coworkers, and the group approached the clothing together. As they drew nearer to the clothes, their hearts sank. It wasn't just a pile of clothing. Skeleton lay inside them, and with the skull being several feet away. The men ran back to their vans and called the Barron County Sheriff's Department, who in turn called the medical examiner to the scene. Once the remains were located and photographed, they were sent to the medical examiner's office, who, in conjunction with local forensic anthropologists, started their investigation. The bones were categorized and counted, and the investigation could begin. It didn't take long for the medical examiner and the anthropologist to determine that the remains belonged to what they believed was a white male aged 18 to 24 with brown hair, 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 9 inches. Under 180 to 195 pounds. His remains were entirely skeletal, and it's estimated that he'd been out and exposed to elements since May or April of that year, possibly earlier. Disturbingly, the man had met a violent end, with the medical examiner finding 3 puncture wounds to the chest, so deep that they left marks on the thoracic vertebra. Investigators couldn't discern whether the man had met his end in the woods or whether he'd been dumped there after the fact. With few pieces of evidence to work with, investigators turned to their next clue, the clothing. The man was found wearing blue Sears brand jeans in a size 38 waist, a long-sleeve cotton Western-style plaid shirt with pearl buttons, a denim jacket, Maverick brand white underwear, white athletic socks with a blue trim, and size 10 blue tennis shoes with white stripes. Investigators found corresponding cut marks on the man's shirt and jacket to where he had been stabbed. The man didn't have a wallet with him, and it doesn't appear that the clothes held any names or labels or clues to his identity. But investigators were not done with his bones. In fact, they had a story of their own to tell. According to the Doe Network, the Barron County John Doe, as he'd come to be known, had a surgically repaired left knee with a screw and staple in his tibia. The screws and staples had serial numbers on them, but the manufacturer couldn't trace them to a specific hospital. The Doe Network also noted something very interesting. In their reports, they wrote, quote, "The procedure would have required a sophisticated hospital, an extended hospitalization, and a long recovery period, 6 months to a year. This points to the young man coming from a comfortable middle-class, perhaps very affluent family, as they would have been able to provide him with the money for the procedure and recovery." Despite all of this information and extensive searches in dental records, hospital records, no one came forward to claim him, leading him to be dubbed the Barron County John Doe. With so much medical information in this case, investigators found it hard to believe that it would go unsolved for so long, but it did for 38 years. In 2019, a new breath of life was given to the case when the Barron County Sheriff's Office contacted the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit organization specializing in unidentified human remains. By December 2019, the DNA Doe Project had uncovered their victim's identity. Shortly after, the Barron County Sheriff's Office collected DNA from the victim's family to confirm the match. In early 2020, the Barron County Sheriff's Office was finally ready to announce that the 1982 Barron County John Doe was Craig Patrick King. He would have been 20 or 21 years old at the time of his death. Craig was born in 1961 in White Bear Lake, Minnesota, and graduated the White Bear Lake High School in 1979. According to Craig's parents, they last saw him in White Bear Lake sometime in 1981. Craig had a documented history of mental illness, and the last time they had seen him, he'd been carrying several $1,000s of cash with him. White Bear Lake is around 82 miles from Barron County, and it's unclear how he ended up there as he didn't own a car. He was remembered as a well-liked young adult. In school, he'd played hockey and golf. He was an avid athlete and an excellent student in school. His father said that Craig was personable, but feels he must have talked to the wrong people. No one who knew Craig could think of anyone who would want to harm him or why. He had been reported missing, and it's unclear why his missing persons case wasn't connected to the body discovered in 1982. Though his family is relieved to have him home finally, but the manner of Craig's death has caused them a lot of pain. They're now appealing to the public for anyone with information to come forward. Case number 3, Sherry Dean Bethel. I want to just start out by saying there's a distinct lack of information in this case about missing person Sherry Bethel. In 1972, Sherry Lee Dean married for the first time at 17 years old, but their marriage only lasted until February of 1974. According to the Charlie Project, Sherry married her second husband, whose last name was Taylor, 3 months after the divorce from her first husband had been finalized. Around May or June of 1974. Sherry and her second husband lived in Fort Worth, Texas, and by 1976, the pair had a 1-year-old child. This is where Sherry's case takes a strange turn due to a lack of evidence. According to her second husband, Sherry was last seen on July 15, 1976. Her husband reported her missing soon after, telling the Fort Worth Police Department that Sherry had walked out on him and their child, but couldn't provide a reason why. Interestingly, it appears that the husband had filed for divorce exactly 1 year after he reported her missing. By July 1977, the divorce was finalized, but Sherry was still nowhere to be found. One web sleuth user has suggested that Sherry might be Nipton Jane Doe 778 UFCA. The Nipton Jane Doe was found in May of 1976, although it's possible that Sherry disappeared long before her husband reported her missing. When looking at mortuary photographs of the Nipton Jane Doe, a resemblance to Sherry can be seen. The Nipton Jane Doe does fit the general description, but had no signs of prior pregnancies or birth, something that Sherry would have likely displayed. While the similarities between the Nipton Jane Doe and Sherry may seem a lot, it's important to remember that these details are guidelines, and many details have been found to be wrong in the past. The Nipton Jane Doe was found in Nipton, California, 1,200 miles from Fort Worth, Texas. Again, it's not outside the realm of possibility that someone traveled a fair distance to ensure the woman couldn't be identified. We can only speculate and spread awareness in cases like Sherry's, where there's little information and no one to advocate for them. Sherry Bethel, also known as Sherry Dean, her maiden name, or Sherry Taylor, is described as a white female with brown hair and brown eyes, 5 feet 6 inches and 130 pounds. She was 21 years old at the time of her disappearance. Her husband's full name has never been revealed to the public, and law enforcement hasn't revealed much information about the case. We'll be covering a case update from our previous coverage of the Gilgo Beach Rex Hoyerman arrest. For new witnesses have come forward and linked the wife to Hoyerman's crimes. Next is the odd case of missing person Nancy Ng. Then a case update to our video on the murder of Riley Whitelaw. Then a woman's body was discovered dismembered in a dumpster. Her husband, Sam Haskell, has been arrested. And then last, funeral directors in Colorado were arrested for improperly storing remains, and 190 bodies were found on their property. Earlier this month, our video on the arrest of Rex Herman went live. We had been watching the case since the announcement of the arrest in August and had been working on that video for weeks while more information about the Gilgo Beach murders trickled out to the press. At the time we had posted, we hadn't really thought any more bombshells were going to be announced until the trial, which is set to start in February 2024. But I was wrong, and every week since we posted that video, there have been multiple significant updates to the case. So first we're going to start with something that isn't really that serious, just an odd thing that kind of stuck out for me. Essa Ilorup, Rex's wife of almost 30 years, has been in the news a lot recently. First is that she has signed on for $1 million documentary contract with Peacock, and along with Ilorup, their 2 children, both in their 20s, and their lawyers involved, have been reported to have signed 6-figure contracts with the news network. Ilorup has also been attending court appearances with the documentary crew in tow. She's also made a few statements to the media. One was asking for their guns back from forensics. Another has been vague support of Hoyerman and kind of an odd statement that she had only recently filed for divorce, in an attempt to shield herself from future lawsuits. In connection with that statement, Herman has signed over all of their properties to Ilorup in full, which seemed to be a way of protecting their assets. So now into the more serious updates. The Suffolk County District Attorney has announced that new DNA evidence connecting Herman to other cases has been submitted to a grand jury. Once the grand jury has made its decision, new charges can be put forward. Next is the bombshell that was announced and the whole reason I needed to get going on a case update. The other stuff was kind of just things I discovered on the way. For new witnesses have come forward. 2 have already signed official affidavits, and the other 2 are said to be finalizing things, and their affidavits will be released soon. In both witness testimonies of the affidavits we have related to cases Herman has not been charged with yet. The first witness is a woman who claims to have met both Rex and Asa at their home to engage in consensual sexual activity. She said that in the 90s, she had been dating a man who liked to swing. She said that while they had been together, they often went to swingers clubs in New York and were also active in a message board which allowed them to meet with other couples looking to swing privately. She stated that her partner had been a police officer at the time, and the members of the swingers clubs that they attended was primarily other members of law enforcement and the New York judicial system. She said that in February of 1996, around Valentine's Day, her partner responded to a private party at a Long Island home in Massapequa Park and arranged an evening with the well-known couple Rex Herman and his wife Asa. Rex had asked them to bring a sex worker with them, and she remembers the woman as looking like Karen Vergata but couldn't remember her name. Though even if she had asked, Karen likely wouldn't have even given her real name. One of the victims that would be later discovered at Gilgo Beach. She said that they arrived at the home late and she stayed upstairs while Karen, her boyfriend, and Rex went down to the basement of the home. She had stayed upstairs with Asa. She said that she'd been at the home for a few hours and she detailed what the home had looked like inside, and apparently it matched some of the identifiers law enforcement had also noted in the home. She stated that when they'd been about to leave, she saw Karen at the window. She was naked and appeared to be screaming for help. She noted the woman looked scared and asked her boyfriend about it, and he said that the woman was playing a game and it was fine. She said that it had been a memory that haunted her. Lastly, the initials of the boyfriend were only in the documents as RW, and she stated he had complained on the way home about losing a belt while he was there. Maybe this is the link to the initials on the belt Herman had used to allegedly bind Maureen Brainerd Barnes. The witness said that they came forward when Rex Herman had been arrested, and when Karen, she remembers her face vividly as the sex worker that they had brought with them to the Hermans' home. Though a significant amount of time has passed since 1996, she said that the encounter had always stuck with her. And law enforcement believed it was a credible statement given the number of details she'd been able to recall that matched what detectives knew of the case. No word yet on whether the boyfriend, who would also be a potential witness, will come forward or if he will be brought in by the courts as a witness. The other concerning statement was made by a taxi driver who believes Shannon Gilbert was in her cab following a scary encounter with Rex Hoyerman at a motel. This would have been months before Shannon made the 911 call and disappeared. The cab driver stated that it had been late one night when she was asked by her dispatcher to pick up a woman at the Sayville Motor Lodge. She had been advised by her dispatcher that the woman who had called was locked in the bathroom of the motel room and that the woman was upset. She seemed scared and had specifically requested a female cab driver. She said that once she found the correct room, she parked and waited. After a couple minutes, she started flashing her lights into the room. Then a couple minutes after that, she started honking and flashing her lights. After a couple of minutes of making quite a bit of noise, she saw a man emerge from the motel room. The man had placed his arms over his face, but she could tell he was a very large man, white, with a lot of white in his hair, and she said that he had, quote, a bit of a belly. She said that she watched him get into his vehicle, a greenish-gray SUV, and drive off. Once the man drove off, a petite woman came out of the hotel room. She described her likeness to be very similar to Shannon Gilbert and said that the girl was shaking and crying. She said that she felt that the girl was terrified. As they drove, the two chatted for a bit. She said that the girl said that she'd met the man off of Craigslist and he had said he was rich and would take care of her. She said that he'd placed a thick envelope on the bedside table and said that at the end of the night, the whole envelope was hers. She went on to say that while the man was in the washroom, she opened up the envelope and it was filled with folded torn paper. When she asked the man about it, he became furious and started to get super aggressive. That was when she locked herself in the bathroom and called the taxi company. The cab driver said that they spoke of family, of life, and just made small talk while the cab driver took her to the train station. She wanted to take the 2 a.m. train back into New York City. The taxi driver said that it would be years later that she would recognize the woman who had been in her cab so many years ago. It had been when Rex Herman had been arrested. She recognized the girl from news coverage featuring Shannon Gilbert's murder case, and she recognized the girl's voice from the 911 call. State police. If this witness statement turns out to be factual, this could offer an explanation as to what might have happened the night Shannon was murdered. Maybe Rex had been in that house and that was why she'd been so terrified. We won't know the status of these witness testimonies, likely until trial. Both of the statements will need to go through a fact-checking process because at this point, they are just statements, but I'm interested to learn if they are in fact facts. This is gearing up to be a lengthy trial. And if this is how it's going to be before it's even started, it's going to be eye-opening for sure. Up next, we have a 29-year-old California woman who's gone missing while on a yoga retreat in Guatemala. Nancy Ng left her home in Monterey Park, California on October 14th and jumped on a plane to head to a yoga retreat at Lake Adeline for what was supposed to be a week of relaxation and grounding. Nancy had attended the retreat in 2022 and had loved it so much that she booked a second trip as soon as she'd been able. However, only days after her arrival, her family back in California were notified by the retreat operators that Nancy had gone missing. The Ng family wasn't given a lot of information about Nancy's disappearance and were extremely distressed. Said that according to one of the other attendees, Christina Blazik, she and Nancy had been out in kayaks but were away from the group, and she claims that Nancy hopped out of her kayak to swim, and when Blazik wasn't looking, Nancy disappeared under the water. Then that was it. Despite a swift response from law enforcement, the Ng family didn't get much information as to what had happened to Nancy, which was a shock. Tonight, the desperate search for Nancy Ng, a California woman who vanished from a yoga retreat in Guatemala. We just really want to find Nancy and bring her home. We want the truth. We want to understand what happened. The 29-year-old from Monterey Park disappearing near Lake Atitlan, a tourist hotspot popular for retreats and wellness getaways, a place Nancy had visited once before. She had gone on the same Guatemalan yoga retreat last year as well. Same host, mostly the same itinerary as well, but she loved it so much she wanted to go back again. And many of the other retreat attendees had left Guatemala. The day after Nancy had disappeared, returning back to the U.S. before authorities even had a chance to speak to them. They'd also discovered that the kayak company that had rented the kayaks to the group had been the ones to raise concerns about the missing woman. 10 people had gone out and 10 boats returned, but only 9 people came out of the lake. It was bizarre circumstances and confusing behavior not only from the company responsible for keeping everyone safe, but also the other attendees. Days went by without any answers and no signs of Nancy Ng. Nancy was athletic, a strong swimmer, and was adventurous but wasn't reckless. And the Ng family couldn't understand why more wasn't done by the retreat to find Nancy when they learned that she'd gone missing. Theory that Nancy had jumped out of her kayak and drowned didn't make sense. Why had the woman, who had last been seen with Nancy, a California attorney no less, not cooperated with the FBI initially, and why had she changed her travel plans to leave hours after Nancy had disappeared? In the meantime, the Ng family hired their own search operation team when local authorities had decided to stop searching for Nancy. They secured a helicopter team in case Nancy had made out of the water. Divers, boat operators, and also coordinated with locals who were aiding in the search. However, they didn't have any idea what part of the lake Nancy had disappeared in, as the retreat goers weren't responding to authorities' pleas to give them more specific information. For weeks, they searched and did what they could to find Nancy. Nancy's sister asked the question when speaking to the media, quote, "Why wouldn't the retreat attendees come forward if nothing nefarious happened?" On November 16th, nearly 4 weeks after Nancy's disappearance, there were now reports that those who had last been with Nancy were now cooperating with the FBI. An attorney for Krista Blazik had stated that the delay in making a statement with the FBI was in part because of what she had experienced in Guatemala was deeply traumatizing, though it was probably more traumatizing for the Ng family not knowing what happened to Nancy. Guatemalan authorities have closed Nancy's missing person case and cited her death as by drowning. Search efforts by the Ng family continue. Last summer, we covered the murder of 17-year-old Riley Whitelaw. She was killed by her coworker while at work at a Colorado Walgreens. The man who killed her is the now 29-year-old Joshua Johnson. Johnson stalked and harassed a teenager for months prior to her murder. Riley had approached management multiple times about the harassment, but the management team at Walgreens didn't do anything to protect the minor. Johnson's trial began on October 1st and lasted 5 days. Johnson's defense was that Riley had been attacked by another man and he ran away in fear, slipping in Riley's blood on the way, which would account for why when he was located walking a highway near the Walgreens he was covered in blood. The jury deliberated for an hour and came back with a guilty verdict. He was sentenced that same day to life in prison. He didn't speak nor apologize to those there to see justice for Riley's murder. A California man has been arrested and charged in connection to 3 murders. This is still a developing story with limited information at this point in time, but here's what we do know. 35-year-old Samuel Haskell IV was arrested after the dismembered torso of his wife, 37-year-old May Lee Haskell, was found in a dumpster. May, along with her parents, were last seen on November 6th. However, friends of May said that she stopped responding to messages on November 5th, which was unusual. May's parents lived with her and Sam, along with their 3 children. A man had been dumpster diving and found a woman's torso. The dumpster was only 5 miles from the Haskell home, and CCTV footage shows a man getting out of a white SUV and carrying what appears to be a heavy bag into the dumpster the day before its discovery. Samuel is the son of former Hollywood producer and CEO of the Miss America pageant Samuel Haskell III. His mother is a former Miss Mississippi. Authorities quickly arrested Samuel, who was found only a few hours after the discovery of the torso. Authorities were alerted to Sam's involvement when there were reports from day laborers Sam had tried to hire to move 4 heavy trash bags. But the bags didn't feel like rocks, and one of the workers opened the bag to find body parts. Sam said that the body parts were part of a horror film production and they left the bags and the home and called law enforcement. When law enforcement arrived, they didn't see anything out of the ordinary and the bags were gone, so there wasn't anything they could do at that time. However, after the discovery of the torso, LAPD were able to obtain a search warrant and discovered a significant amount of blood evidence within the home. At this time, Sam Haskell has been arrested and is being held on a $2 million bail while the investigation continues. So far, only the torso of who they believe is May has been found so far. Her parents' bodies have not been discovered, but law enforcement believe they are deceased. Samuel is being held on suicide watch and has so far pleaded not guilty to the 3 murder charges. He faces life in prison if convicted or possibly even the death penalty. His next court appearance is scheduled for December 8th. The three sons are in custody of their paternal grandparents. At this point in time, the motive is unclear, but there are reports that Sam had been acting paranoid and odd before his arrest. Samuel collected samurai swords, machetes, and other bladed weapons. He had threatened a childhood friend with a machete when the two had gotten into an argument recently. May is remembered as a loving and outgoing woman. She often hosted dinner parties with neighbors, and she loved being surrounded by friends and family. The community is shocked and is mourning the loss of a beloved friend. And now for our last case. Joyce Pavetti was doing yard work in early October when she noticed an unpleasant smell initially. She and her husband had assumed the stench was from a decaying animal nearby. However, over the next few days, the smell got worse. They thought the smell might have been coming from their neighbor, their return to nature funeral home. But that didn't make much sense. They had assumed the company had been closed as it had been months since they'd seen anyone in or out of the building. When the smell started to get unbearable, they called the Fremont County Sheriff's Office and an officer came to check it out. Within days, the FBI and state and federal agencies descended onto the property. When a search warrant had been executed for the property, it was an unimaginable, horrific nightmare. Over 100 human bodies were discovered decaying and improperly stored in what is being described as a, quote, hazardous way. The property owners, funeral directors, John and Carrie Halford, were arrested in Oklahoma on suspicion of committing abuse of a corpse, theft, money laundering, and forgery. The Halfords owned two properties in Colorado, one in Penrose where the bodies were discovered and the other in Colorado Springs. They started the business in 2017, but it was soon discovered that they had lost their license to operate funeral services in 2022. However, they continued operating for a year afterward. After the arrest, the significant task of identifying the remains started. There were nearly 200 bodies on the property, and through dental records, some were quick to identify, but when officers approached the next of kin for the identification, they were shocked to learn that many of these people believed that their loved one had been cremated. In fact, they had their ashes, leading investigators to ask the question, who or what was in these urns? We will never know what our families are actually carrying. Some of them may be concrete dust, some of them may be other things. We won't ever know, so it can't even describe the emotions our families are going through. Christina Page, whose family was among those decedents found inside the funeral home last month. Law enforcement also discovered that the Halfords were being sued by a local crematory and various vendors for unpaid bills. So far, 190 bodies have been found, and of those 110 have been identified. Colorado called a state of emergency, which allowed them to open up for assistance from the federal government and also get assistance from other states to make sure all of the victims' remains were cremated and returned to their loved ones. Carrie and John Halford are being held while they await formal charges. They're being held on a $2 million bond. At least one family has filed a lawsuit against the funeral home. It would be a case that reshaped the diving industry across the globe. An American couple diving in the Great Barrier Reef in beautiful Queensland, Australia, were left behind in open waters by the diving company responsible for keeping them safe. None of their fellow divers, the captain, or the crew noticed them not in the boat at the scheduled return time and made the hour-and-a-half journey back to shore, leaving the Lonergans in the shark-infested waters. They wouldn't be discovered missing for over 48 hours. When the search began, there had been no trace of the couple. Since their disappearance, there have been rumors of a suicide pact, murder, or that there had been a larger plan to stage their deaths and start new lives. But no one can really know without a doubt what happened to Eileen and Tom Lonergan. Let's get into it. It had been a perfect day for diving on January 25th, 1998. Married couple 33-year-old Tom Lonergan and his 28-year-old wife Eileen Lonergan were on a weekend getaway after wrapping up a 2-year contract with the Peace Corps teaching in Fiji. The water was said to have been as clear as glass, no wind, and near perfect visibility. That morning they left their hostel in Cairns, Australia, and took a pre-booked 40-minute bus ride to Port Douglas. They had booked the round-trip shuttle ahead of time, and they were set to return when the dive tour completed around 4:30 p.m. The Australian trip was going to cap off their time in the South Pacific. They were headed back to a new chapter of their lives, going back to a quote-unquote normal life back in Baton Rouge, Louisiana for the first time in years. They seemed to both struggle with what their lives were going to be moving forward. Tom had enrolled in college but didn't have a lot of direction. We know this because they both kept extremely detailed and poetic diaries. The way they wrote was lyrical, expressive, and dramatic. They wrote in hand-bound leather books, and they wrote in a way that left all of their emotions, thoughts, and fears on the page, and they wrote a lot, near daily, with pages and pages of entries. In Fiji, they had lived in a remote village. For years, they lived without electricity and running water. They taught together, but Eileen struggled with the students. Tom was better at it, but neither shared a passion for teaching, but they did care about their students. They both shared a deep love for the ocean. They were very experienced and competent divers, and their love of the sea was something that really bonded the pair together. Diving had been something Eileen had been passionate about before she'd met Tom, and was something that she'd passed on to him. While diving in Fiji, Eileen wrote to her mother about an extremely emotional experience that they'd had in the water. They'd been approached by a whale, so close they'd been able to reach out and touch it. Eileen looked into the whale's eyes and felt a deep connection to the animal. It had been a spiritual experience for both Tom and Eileen, and it left them buzzing. Tom wrote after the experience, quote, "Like a student who has finished an exam, I feel that my life is complete and I'm ready to die. As far as I can tell from here, my life can only get worse. It's peaked. It's all downhill from here until my funeral." They arrived at the harbor at 8:30 a.m. and boarded the tour boat operated by the Outer Edge. They were joined by 26 other guests. Not everyone was diving, most were snorkeling, but all had been promised a spectacular day on the water. It was absolutely ideal conditions, and the group was incredibly excited to get going. The crew loaded the gear on the boat and put air tanks and other diving gear, accounting for everyone diving that day. Outer Edge had planned on taking the group to 3 different sites, staying at each area for about an hour and a half before heading back to port. It was an all-day package, and there wasn't a second tour booked that day for the boat or the crew. The Lonergans had a lot of their own diving gear, and despite the heat of the day, they opted to dive in full protective gear. And their experience allowed them to maximize their air tanks, allowing them to be in the water just a little bit longer. For the first 2 dives, they'd been the last 2 people back on the boat, capitalizing on every second they could be in the water. Their last dive for the day was an area of the reef called Fish City. It had spectacular displays of thousands of fish, and it was going to be the highlight of the tour. There are some reports that the boat that day was running late. It was about 3:30 p.m. when Outer Edge started up the engine to depart the area. So every time a passenger went into the water, they were supposed to log out and then log back in when they were back on the vessel. And another measure of security is conducting a head count. The boat sat for about 15 minutes while the crew checked everyone back onto the boat, put away all the equipment, and passed out cold refreshments to the passengers and counted everyone up before heading back to Port Douglas. Not one of the crew members had noticed that 2 of their guests for the day hadn't checked back in, and their head count was too short. Once back at the port, the guests departed, taking all of their belongings with them. And again, no concerns were raised when 2 pairs of shoes and 2 backpacks were left on the boat. The bus driver also waited nearby. The bus company knew that the Lonergans had gone out with Outer Edge, so after waiting for about an hour, the driver went up to the crew and asked if they knew where the Lonergans were, as they'd booked a shuttle back to Cairns and he needed to get going. The captain, Jack Nairn, reassured the driver that the Lonergans must have taken another method back to their hostel and to just head out. The driver felt that had been very strange and called his supervisor, who also spoke to Outer Edge, but both times they were reassured that maybe the Lonergans had made friends with other guests and had gone out with them, just tourists doing tourist things. The bus driver eventually left, and the crew brought the Lonergans' belongings back to their office. And then everyone went home. Well, everyone except Tom and Eileen. The next morning, Outer Edge returned to the same area that they'd been the previous day. And a crew member with the company was out at Fish City with clients and discovered 6 loose diving weights on the seabed with the Outer Edge label on them. However, again, this wasn't marked as odd. There were lots of different diving companies, and some people were careless with the equipment, so it was normal for crew members to tidy up after clients. It wouldn't be until Tuesday evening, 2 full days since the Lonergans had been left at sea, when employees at the Outer Edge office decided to open up the bags left behind from the Sunday excursion. Inside, they found the Lonergans' wallets, travel documents, and cash, things they'd been unlikely to forget for 2 days traveling. Panic and realization began to set in for the employees at Outer Edge. Phone records showed staff members making frantic calls, trying to find a better outcome than what they assumed might have happened. When they called the Lonergans' hostel, the Walkabout, and spoke to the owner, Barry Waymans, Barry confirmed that they hadn't seen the Lonergans since they took a shuttle out to Port Douglas. The hostel owner had been the one who was furious, and it was he who called the police to report the couple missing. Police were called 52 hours after the Outer Edge had left Fish City and left Tom and Eileen in the water. By the time the police had been called, search conditions were not good. It was too dark and the search couldn't be started until dawn. In addition to law enforcement and local searchers, the Australian Navy had been called in to aid the search. 20 aircrafts were also deployed to search 8,600 nautical square miles. In total, there were waterplanes, helicopters, boats, divers, and people on foot searching the coastlines near the reefs. All were looking for any sign of the missing American couple. Once the search was underway, there had been maintained hope that Eileen and Tom could have survived for up to 4 days in the water. They had already lost nearly 3 days in the delay, but there was still hope. Unlike many of their companions, Tom and Eileen had gone out that day in full gear, despite the warm weather. They had on heavy, long-sleeve wetsuits, hoods, and gloves, which would have been critical and had the potential to really increase their chances of staving off hypothermia. However, dehydration was still a concern, and a deadly predator known to stalk that area: tiger sharks. After 4 days of searching and finding no sign of Tom and Eileen, the search was eventually called off. Law enforcement found several things strange. The first was with Outer Edge. How had they left 2 of their passengers out in the water that day? The company was thoroughly investigated by law enforcement. The captain took full responsibility for the mistake, but it had been the whole crew ultimately responsible. The captain stated that the logbooks not being filled out was a negligent mistake and a bad habit picked up over time, where the crew would fill the logbooks out while they were heading back. But for some reason, it had just been missed entirely that day. He said that a head count had been conducted while people were still coming onto the deck from the water, and initially the count had come up short. But a recount had accidentally accounted for a couple who had been in the water at the start of the count, and then they were accounted again when they came up onto the boat. Other guests who were also diving reported seeing the couple about 15 minutes before they were all supposed to wrap up their dives for the day, so they couldn't have been that far from the boat. Sound carries underwater quite a distance, and the boat had been idling for some time while the crew got everything in order to leave and also handing out drinks to guests. No one can understand how Tom and Eileen had missed the boat, even if they were a bit far away initially. Next were the circumstances of Tom and Eileen's disappearance. What also stood out as odd with law enforcement was when they discovered that there had been other vessels anchored at St. Crispin's Reef, the area where Outer Edge had anchored at. Many of the other boats were there long after Outer Edge had left, and no one reported seeing or hearing anyone in distress. One fishing boat had stayed in the area as late as midnight and had remained lit. The waters had been calm, and the boat would have been easy to spot. They also heard nothing, and in those conditions, they should have been able to hear someone calling for help in the water, even from quite a distance. Without any sign of the couple, this was when the theories started rolling in about what kind of people the Lonergans were. Their diaries were located amongst their belongings left behind at the hostel, and detectives started to pick apart their lives. The couple had met while attending the University of Louisiana. They got married in Jefferson, Texas on June 24, 1988. The two had always had a very intense and passionate relationship. They were both extremely intelligent people. Tom describes himself as having few great loves in his life, and they were his intellect, his wife, his students, and diving. Tom was known to be kind of harsh and intense, and Eileen was the complete opposite of him and softened him. She was also the adventurous one of the two, and it had been her idea to join the Peace Corps. In Tom's diary, he writes that Eileen had been a gift from God and wrote of his utter devotion to his wife. Eileen wrote of her concerns for their marriage, and not that she didn't love Tom, but that she felt that she was losing her individuality. In their time on the remote islands in isolation, they had become one, but over time, the relationship had become too codependent for Eileen's taste. They both wrote about concerns they had for the future. Tom's diary starts to get a bit macabre. He wrote about life and God and their meanings. They each wrote of these kinds of large philosophical discussions that they'd been having. Eileen wrote, quote, "Tom hopes to die a quick and painless death, and he hopes it happens soon. Tom's not suicidal, but he's got a death wish, and that could lead him to what he desires, and I could get caught in that." It had been that passage that led to several speculations that their disappearance hadn't just been a simple accident. Accusations that Tom had wanted to die and had perhaps wanted the two of them to die together, and had purposely missed the boat. However, it's important to note that they were really reading between the lines with that conclusion. Their writing style was consistently very dramatic and lyrical. There were also permanent pontoon structures built all around St. Crispin's Reef. The closest one had only been 6 kilometers from where Outer Edge had anchored. The structures are used as docking structures for various tours. It helps to not damage the reefs by using anchors near the delicate ecosystems. Experts speculated that they could have swum to them and hid there overnight and then got onto another boat when the tours started coming back in. There had been reports that at the Agincourt pontoon or Quicksilver pontoon, there had been a large vessel filled with Italian tourists. The head count before departure had been over by 3 guests, but it was chalked up to a miscount. However, Tom and Eileen's disappearance drew media attention. The vessel came forward with the report in case it turned out to be relevant. There were sightings of the couple all over Australia, which again drew law enforcement's attention to theories that the couple had staged their deaths to start a new life. What hadn't helped was that Tom and Eileen had been adamant that they didn't want to dive with others or with a dive master, and they wanted to go off on their own that day, which at the time hadn't drawn any concerns given that they were very experienced divers, but after the disappearance had led to more questions on why they wanted to be by themselves. 3 months went by and Eileen's family went to Australia to see where Eileen and Tom had disappeared. They even dived the waters in the area with the help of Australian authorities escorting them. They eventually held a funeral for the couple and after seeing the area for themselves came to terms with the fact that the couple were no longer with them. 6 months after their disappearance, a team still looking for any signs of the Lonergans was combing a remote beach in Port Douglas when they saw something sticking out of the sand. The first item found was a woman's wetsuit. It was the same style that Eileen had been wearing the day that they had been last seen. It was the same size. It had a little damage on the bottom and the armpit area, but it had likely come from rubbing against coral in the currents before washing ashore. Otherwise, the suit was in pretty pristine condition. Once one item was found, a larger team was deployed to the area and soon other items tied to the Lonergans were discovered. Over 100 kilometers or 75 miles from Fish City, they found 2 inflatable dive jackets, and these had Tom and Eileen's names written on the inside. So there was no speculation of who they belonged to. The next items found were dive tanks and 1 fin. Like the wetsuit, none of the items appeared to be damaged. They had searched for any sign of a shark attack. But other than some sun damage and barnacle growth, the items were in incredible condition. The clasps on the dive jackets also seemed to have been manually released rather than slipped off. It appeared that they had removed the gear themselves. They searched the area hoping to recover bodies, but they weren't found. Then a diver's slate was found by fishermen 90 miles from where Eileen and Tom had been diving, around 6 months after their disappearance. The slate had been badly exposed to the elements, but once the fishermen made it out, they knew exactly who the slate had belonged to. It said, Monday, January 26, 1988, 8 a.m. To anyone can help us. We have been abandoned here in Agincourt Reef by the MV Outer Edge. January 25, 1998, 3 p.m. Please help us or we will die. Help. Tom and Eileen Lonergan 1502 Lenmore. The slate went through an extensive authentication verification. Based on the algae growth and the handwriting, experts believed that the slate was Tom Lonergan's and he did write that note. According to the slate, it appeared that the Lonergans had made it at least until the following morning, only missing the next round of tourist boats by hours. But the slate still didn't explain why other vessels nearby hadn't seen or heard any sign of them that first night. Despite finding all of these belongings of Eileen and Tom, it still ultimately only caused more questions than answers. Had delirium caused them to take off their equipment? Without the buoyancy vests, it would have made it impossible for them to tread water that long. And why did Eileen take off her wetsuit? Outer Edge and the owner, Jack Nairn, were charged with unlawful killing. At trial, Nairn was found not guilty, but Outer Edge was fined severely after pleading guilty. The company soon went out of business, and one report has said that none of the crew connected to the Lonergan trip worked in the diving industry anymore. Nairn deeply apologized to Eileen's family, and they gave him a hug after the trial and said that they forgave him. 9 months after their disappearance, Tom and Eileen were declared deceased by the Australian coroner's inquest. Their cause of death was listed as drowning or shark attack. One tiger shark expert from Port Douglas stated, quote, "My personal feeling is that they were taken by a tiger shark in the first 24 to 48 hours. Dead or alive, you wouldn't last too long out there." Because of the case, Australia implemented new regulations for the diving industry, including mandatory head counts conducted by captains and dive masters. More thorough regulations regarding the logbooks, more training for staff, and mandatory lookouts on board every tour boat, as well as harsher regulations and fines for negligence and noncompliance. Though there's no evidence that directly points to Eileen and Tom having made it out of the water, it wouldn't have been an impossible feat. Another former Baton Rouge resident, Milton Windsor Harris, had been on the run for 16 years, escaping prison for corporate embezzlement, and fakes his death by jumping off of a ferry in New Zealand. He was discovered on the other side of the planet in Northern Ireland with his wife and 3 children. We may never know what happened to Eileen and Tom Lonergan, and without the discovery of their bodies, there will be no certainty in their disappearance, ultimately chalked up to an avoidable tragedy. Before we continue, we have a surprise for you. We have made a new channel in which we upload cold mystery cases that will shiver your timbers. Don't miss out, link is in description. In the world of true crime, there are mysteries that capture our attention, and then there are those that haunt us for decades. Little Miss Nobody is one of those cases that has defied explanation and lingered in the shadows for a staggering 62 years. But the latest twist in this tale has us both riveted and sobered. Little Miss Nobody is no longer a nameless victim. She's now known by her name, Sharon Lee Gallegos. Picture this, a little girl found alone in the unforgiving Arizona desert, her identity a riddle, and her fate a chilling question mark. For years, her story has been a ghostly presence in the history of unsolved mysteries, leaving investigators stumped and a community in perpetual mourning. But today, we stand at a crossroads of discovery and heartache as a cold case has thawed just enough to reveal a glimmer of truth. Today, we'll take a deep dive into the perplexing saga of Little Miss Nobody, examining the gravity of her abduction, the eerie circumstances surrounding her murder, and the newfound revelation that has sent shockwaves through the world of crime solving. So join us as we navigate the intricate web, the 62-year-old cold case, where casual curiosity meets a sobering reality of a mystery that refuses to be forgotten. It was on July 31st, 1960, and a cool morning in Sandwash Creek, Arizona. A cool breeze washed over the air as residents began their morning. A school teacher from Las Vegas had made his way to Sandwash Creek to look for rocks for his class. And as he was walking, he saw something in the distance. It stood out from the flora and fauna. It was black and charred. When he drew closer, he uncovered the grisly truth, kickstarting a 6-decade-long mystery. When the teacher drew nearer, he noticed a small mound of dirt. After lightly brushing the dirt away, he found the crudely and shallowly buried body. The body was small, and he quickly realized it was that of a child. The remains were heavily decomposed due to the Arizona heat and the conditions under which she had been disposed of. Minutes later, the devastated teacher was pointing the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office in the direction of the remains. The county medical examiner's office was not far behind them, and the crime scene investigation began. Officers discovered the remains had been placed in a shallow grave, and the person responsible for dumping and burying the remains had then set them ablaze, perhaps to hide the evidence or make the identification more difficult. 2 sets of footprints were found near the makeshift shallow grave, with one of them distinctly belonging to a male adult. Disturbingly, 2 other mounds of disturbed and charred soil were found, indicating her killer had tried to burn and dispose of the remains twice before settling on a final spot. A detail that remains perplexing to this day. The remains were transported to the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office, where the heartbreaking autopsy would take place. Medical examiner determined that the remains likely belonged to a Caucasian female aged 2 to 7 years old, although this was later refined to 3 to 6 years old. The girl had brown or auburn hair, was 3 feet 5 inches, and was 50 to 55 pounds. All of her baby teeth were present and in pristine condition. There were no signs of trauma to her bones. Given that the remains had been burned and left in the Arizona heat for at least 1 to 2 weeks before being discovered, the remains were too decomposed to draw full conclusion on how the girl had died or exactly when. There were no fractures, healed or new, and due to the nature of her discovery, the case was marked as a homicide. Medical examiner investigators next turned their attention to the clothes that the girl had been found wearing. According to the Doe Network, she was wearing a sunsuit with white or pink shorts, a contrasting blouse with a chain design, and a pair of men's adult flip-flops purposely cut down to her size and affixed to her feet with brown leather straps. Her fingernails and toenails had also been painted red. By all accounts, it appeared that the young girl had been physically well looked after, so how would she come to be dumped in a shallow grave next to a creek? Investigators broadcasted information about the girl's discovery across local media outlets, but few viable leads emerged. The discovery of such a young girl dumped in such a callous way deeply affected the community. The community of Prescott came together to raise money for her funeral and headstone. Midway through 1960, the little girl was buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Prescott, Arizona. The headstone that read, "Little Miss Nobody and blessed are the pure in heart." Around 70 people from the local community gathered to remember Little Miss Nobody, a name she would carry for 62 years. Meanwhile, investigators had another clue they had held back from the public. At the scene, they had discovered tire tracks. The first proved that the killer had driven onto the creek from the direction of Highway 93 before parking and finding a spot to dump the young girl. After disposing of her, they jumped back into their vehicle, pulling partway into the desert sand and taking a left, turning and driving away from the site. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear as though investigators were able to determine the make or model of the car from its tire tracks. The footprints had also become a key area of importance for investigators. One pair had been made by an adult, with the other being made by a child in flip-flops, an eerie coincidence to the details of the case. Investigators speculated that the girl was forced to walk to her burial site with the attacker before being buried. Close to the crime scene, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office found a rusted, blood-stained knife. The knife was sent to the FBI for further testing, but it's unclear whether this was ever conclusively linked to the case. In 1960, DNA testing was not available, so the FBI would only have been able to obtain the blood type from the knife. Whilst this may seem insignificant, it may have helped investigators narrow down their pool of possible victims based on this parameter. Shortly after the details of Little Miss Nobody's case went public, an anonymous witness came forward with a fascinating story. In the days before Little Miss Nobody had been found, he had witnessed a family walking through the desert. The group consisted of a man, a woman, 2 boys, 2 girls, and a baby. The witness was able to describe the clothes of one of the girls, which fit the description of Little Miss Nobody's body. The day the witness saw this group was the day before Little Miss Nobody's body had been found. Another witness came forward to have claimed to have seen the same family, but this time there was only 1 girl, 2 boys, a baby, and the 2 adults. The witnesses both believed that the family had been transient based on their appearance and commented that they were wearing overalls and cloth caps. Investigators honed in on the transient family and were able to find a family fitting their description in the area. However, despite extensive questioning, nothing ever came of this lead. And like all the others, it eventually fizzled into nothing. There were several possible candidates of missing children that could have possibly been Little Miss Nobody, one of which was 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gallegos from Alamogordo, New Mexico. The possibility that Sharon Lee Gallegos was Little Miss Nobody was greatly overlooked when the medical examiner determined that the body had likely belonged to a 7-year-old girl, making her much older than Sharon. In the years that have passed, this number was revised several times based on new analysis. The clothing found on Little Miss Nobody also didn't match the clothes that Sharon had last been wearing when she'd been abducted. Add to this that Sharon had disappeared over 500 miles from Sandwash Creek, and investigators felt hope slipping through their fingers. The final nail in the coffin for this lead were the results of the FBI footprint analysis that were carried out in August 1960. Footprints from Little Miss Nobody and Sharon were compared and were found to not be the same. After this, investigators were forced to drop this lead and consider other missing girls. Some investigators never let go of this thought though, and it lingered in their minds for decades to come. After Sharon was ruled out, the case's leads also dried up and the case eventually fell cold. Occasional tips and leads would be called in, but none of them ever led to the identity of Little Miss Nobody. And in a devastating blow to the case, the storage area that housed the evidence for the case, which included the knife, the clothing, and other pieces of items collected from the scene, were damaged in a water leak that had gone unnoticed for some time. All of the evidence collected for the case had to be disposed of, and who knows what critical evidence had been lost. The case fell silent until 2015 when the NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, paid to have the remains exhumed. By this time, the case had garnered attention in online sleuth circles, many of whom had a good idea of who the body belonged to. Little Miss Nobody was exhumed in 2015 and a DNA sample was extracted from their remains. According to Othram Labs, this sample was able to give them a mitochondrial DNA profile which was passed down through their maternal lineage. This DNA sample was uploaded to Cody's, and initially no matches were found. Whilst this was a small setback, investigators felt confident that this new DNA evidence would be the key to unlocking the case. In 2018, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children also worked with forensic specialists to create the first ever facial approximation sketch of Little Miss Nobody. After decades of being faceless, the public now had a possibility of what she may have looked like. This new reconstruction was circulated in the media, and soon after the calls started to roll in, many believed that the girl in the reconstruction bore a striking resemblance to the abducted child Sharon Lee Gallegos. Although Sharon had been initially ruled out in August 1960, the Yavapai investigators knew better than to discount the unlikely. The county sheriff's office contacted Othram in 2021 and requested their assistance. Othram used Little Miss Nobody's remains to obtain another DNA profile despite what they called a substantial degradation and extreme non-human DNA burden. With this new sample, Othram hoped to perform a KinSnap rapid familial testing, which is a DNA test that confirms relationships between siblings. Genealogists had been working hard behind the scenes using the information obtained by Othram and the public and were able to track down possible siblings of Little Miss Nobody. Thanks to the KinSnap testing, it was only a matter of weeks until the truth could finally be discovered. In March 2022, Othram and the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office held a joint press conference in which they announced that Little Miss Nobody was the missing 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gallegos of Alamogordo, New Mexico. On July 21, 1960, just 10 days before her body had been found, Sharon was abducted from the backyard of her grandmother's home. At the time, Sharon was outside playing with her cousins when a man and a woman in a dark green sedan, a 1951 or 1952 Plymouth or Dodge, pulled up to the curb. According to her cousins, a freckle-faced young boy was also in the car, along with another child. The woman first wound down her window called out to Sharon, asking her to come with them unto the promise of sweets and new clothes. Sensing danger, Sharon said no, which only angered the woman. Within seconds, she flew out of the passenger seat, grabbed Sharon by the elbow, and threw her into the car. The vehicle then sped off into the distance before anyone in the Gallegos family were able to react. Sharon was swiftly reported missing, and investigators immediately began their search for her. Roadblocks had been set up within minutes of her abduction, and to this day it remains unclear how Sharon had been spirited out of El Mongordo. Her cousins described the man behind the wheel as white and thin with a long nose and sandy hair. The woman was described as white, short, in her 30s with dirty blonde hair. In the days before Sharon disappeared, her family had noticed a few bizarre goings-on. At a church service, a woman had been asking about Sharon and her mother, Guadalupe. Days later, the same woman arrived at a neighbor's house asking probing questions about Sharon and her mother. The woman was keen to know all about Sharon, whether Guadalupe had any other children and who else lived in their home. There are also reports that Sharon had become timid and withdrawn in the days before her abduction and had mentioned a dark green car following her. Investigators believe that Sharon's kidnappers had planned the attack and had been following her for some time before they struck. But to this day, their identities remain a mystery, as does the identity of the freckle-faced boy who was also in the vehicle. Is he also a John Doe waiting to be uncovered deep in the Arizona desert? Well, one door in this case has closed, another remains open, and investigators are determined to uncover who did this to Sharon. Why have these people taken her and spent so much time stalking her to only then kill her 10 days later? There had always been a hope that Sharon had been out there somewhere, maybe had been abducted to have been raised by another family. Sharon's brother, Roberto Juan Gallegos, had been the one to provide the all-important kinship DNA test, which confirmed the remains belonged to his lost sister. He now resides in Germany. Their parents have since passed, but their remains live in aunts, uncles, and many cousins. Those who were still around made a statement to the press expressing their gratitude to bringing Sharon home. How and why she ended up 500 miles away, dressed in different clothes, remain a mystery to both them and the investigators. Her family is also trying to come to terms with the fact that those who took Sharon may have been close to the family or their community. Also made aware of the identification was the last surviving detective who had worked the original case. Now 91 years old, he had been relieved that there had been identification on the case. In 2022, Sharon's body was interred at the St. Francis Delaware Paula Catholic Church in Tularosa, New Mexico, with the remains of her mother and grandmother who had never given up looking for her. The Little Miss Nobody headstone has been removed, and instead Sharon now has a headstone that bears her name, something she has deserved for over 6 decades. Sharon's abduction and murder case remain open and active. As we draw the curtains on the heart-wrenching story of Little Miss Nobody, now known as Sharon Lee Gallegos, we find ourselves at a crossroad of revolution and lingering questions. Sharon's journey from a nameless victim to a beloved daughter, sister, and cousin, whose memory is finally adorned with dignity of her own name, is nothing short of astonishing. The discovery of Sharon's identity brought with it a flood of emotions, relief for her family, validation for the tireless investigators, and renewed sense of hope for justice. But it also left us with a profound sense of sadness as we grapple with the lingering mystery that shroud her abduction and murder. The details of Sharon's tragic story, from our heart-wrenching abduction to the puzzling circumstances surrounding her discovery, have captivated our hearts and minds. Tyler's efforts of investigators, genealogists, and forensic experts have finally pieced together. Why were Sharon's abductors so meticulous in their planning? What drove them to carry out such a heinous act? Who was a freckle-faced boy who was in the dark green sedan with her captors? These questions, like ghostly echoes from the past, remain unanswered. Sharon Lee Gallegos has found her resting place alongside her mother and grandmother, a poignant reunion after 6 decades of separation. These questions, like ghostly echoes from the past, remain unanswered. So what do you think of this mystery? Why do you think Sharon was kidnapped, and what happened in those days following her abduction? In the shadowy underbelly of Los Angeles, a chilling mystery lurked for decades, casting a long and haunting shadow over the city of angels. It was the tale of the Grim Sleeper, a serial killer who eluded justice for years, leaving a trail of fear and unanswered questions in his wake. Join us as we dive into the harrowing story of the Grim Sleeper, a relentless predator who stalked the streets of LA, revealing the shocking twists and turns that eventually led to his capture. Let's get into it. In the mid to late 1980s, South Central Los Angeles, California, later called just South LA, was considered a dangerous place, a bad part of town, and like many other metropolitan areas of the United States, it had been dealing with a crack cocaine epidemic. The area was low income, mainly consisting of people of color, and the people in it were often forgotten. It was an area that more than one serial killer used as their own personal hunting ground. Initially, all of the murders were believed to have been the work of one serial killer who would later be called the Southside Slayer. And it would take years for police to realize that it was not one serial killer, but several different predators all operating in the same area. The victims that we will discuss started in 1985. They would eventually all be connected to one killer. Unfortunately, very little news was released about these victims at the time that they were first discovered. On August 10, 1985, 29-year-old beautician Deborah Jackson left a friend's house as she headed home to the bus to go home. Deborah had recently started working shifts waitressing at a cocktail bar in order to regain custody of her 3 young children. Her friend Elizabeth remembers offering her a ride home instead of taking the bus, but Deborah declined. It was already dark, but Deborah said she would call when she got home, but never did. Deborah's body was found hours later, in an alley near West Gage Avenue in the Vermont-Sluizen area. She had been shot 3 times in the chest. On August 12, 1986, in an alley near the 2500 block of West Vernon Avenue in Hyde Park, Louisiana, the body of Henrietta Wright, 35 years old, was found under an old mattress and green blanket. She had a cloth in her mouth and had been shot several times in the chest. Police were unsure if she'd been killed at that location or somewhere else and then dumped. On January 10, 1987, a man who remains anonymous to this day called 911 saying that he saw a body being dumped from a blue and white Dodge van. He said that it happened 30 minutes before he had called. When authorities arrived at the 1300 block of East 56th Street in the central Alameda area, they found the body had been covered with trash, a gas tank, and later identified her as 23-year-old Barbara Ware. The van was quickly found and was located in a church parking lot only 4.5 miles from where the body had been dumped. The police photos of the van and the 911 call were not released to the public until 2009. Barbara's cause of death was unknown. On April 15, 1987, 26-year-old Bernina Sparks told her mother she was going to the store to get cigarettes but never came home. She was found the next day in a dumpster of the 9400 block of West Southern Avenue in Gray Mercy Park. She had been shot with a small caliber gun. On Halloween 1987, 26-year-old Mary Lowe was last seen when she left home to go to a party with friends. She was later found in an alley later that night in the 8900 block of Western Avenue in Gray Mercy Park. She had also been shot and covered up. It was never released to the public at the time, but about 3 years after Deborah Jackson's murder, police had connected several of these cases through ballistics. Then on January 30th, 1988, 22-year-old Lucretia Jackson was found on the 2000 block of West 102nd Place in the Westmont area under a mattress with a napkin covering her face. Reports have said that the words AIDS was written on it and she'd been shot in the heart. On September 11, 1988, 18-year-old Alicia Alexander was found in an alley near 43rd Place and Western Avenue in Vermont Square. She was found naked and covered in a blue foam mattress. She had been shot and strangled. Just over a month later, a woman by the name of Venitra Washington, who was a 30-year-old mother of two, had recently divorced and was walking to a friend's house to prepare for a party. While she was walking, a stranger pulled up in an orange Ford Pinto. He politely offered her a ride, which she declined. She reported later that the man rolled down his window and she said that the response had made her feel sorry for the man and she eventually agreed to the ride. He seemed nice enough. He was a black man in his 30s, well-kept, and was wearing khakis and a button-up shirt. She later said to the media, quote, "I guess I appeared standoffish, and when he said it, I thought he was being nice and I felt sorry for him. I maybe thought that I came off rough and said, okay, you can take me to the house." They began to drive through South LA. When he started to go in a direction that was not towards where she had asked him to go, the man said he had to make a quick stop at an uncle's house. Anitra said that they went down a side street near an auto shop and the man went to the house and she never asked his name. He had a quick conversation with someone and returned to the vehicle about 10 minutes later. She would say that when he came back he was acting strange, calling her the wrong name and accusing her of strange things. Anitra said suddenly everything went quiet. And that was when she realized she'd been shot. She started to struggle with the man but began to fade in and out of consciousness. She came to for a bit to realize that he was sexually assaulting her. She blacked out and then awakened to the flash of a Polaroid picture being taken. After he then started the car, he pushed Anitra out of the vehicle and then drove off. Anitra managed to pick herself up and walked to her friend's house before being rushed to the hospital. She arrived at the hospital with a collapsed lung. She couldn't have the bullet removed for 5 days, so she was in the hospital, monitored, and eventually it was safe enough to remove it. She spent a total of 2 weeks in hospital. Originally, she thought the man had mistook her for someone else and it had been a mistake that he had shot her. As far as we know, after Anitra's attack, all of the killings connected to this one unknown suspect suddenly stopped. Without any arrests, protesters started calling for action. Community members would come together and start to put up flyers and bulletin boards asking for the police to get these murder cases solved and get this killer caught. For years, there weren't any leads on the case of the murdered and attacked victims. The killings simply stopped after an interest attack and law enforcement wasn't sure why, but weren't sure how long it would last. There were theories that the suspect had died or was arrested. All that was known was that they weren't finding women with gunshot wounds tossed like trash. In 2001, police in South LA started looking at older cold cases, specifically ones that may have DNA evidence that couldn't have been processed back in the 80s. Many of the cases were soon definitively grouped together as perpetrated by the same individual based on DNA and ballistic evidence. The same caliber of weapon was used in all 8 attacks. Then just as soon as the attacks had started in 1985, a new spree of killings began. Though with so much time in between the sprees, over a decade, it would take some time before both sets of attacks could be connected. In 2002, the body of Princess Bartholomew, a 15-year-old teenager, was found naked on March 19th in a bush in an Inglewood alley, strangled and beaten. Princess was last seen by her family on December 21st, 2001. She had been missing since then. Police were able to connect DNA found on Princess to cases from the 1980s. Unfortunately, none of the databases at the time were able to find a match to the suspect's DNA. On July 11, 2003, the body of 35-year-old Valerie McCovey was found in the entrance of an alley on Denker Avenue between 108 and 109th Streets in the Westmont area. Valerie was found with her pants pulled down and she had been strangled to death. It was unclear why there had been a change in how the killer was carrying out these murders. Strangulation was significantly more difficult than using a gun, but it was quieter. Strangulation took time, was physically more challenging, and it needed to be up close. Detectives weren't sure if the change had been for practical reasons or that the way he killed needed to be more violent in order for the sick individual to feel satisfied. Or maybe the killer had been so alarmed that he'd had a victim survive that he needed certainty that they were dead. The last confirmed victim of this serial killer is Genesia Peters, who was found on January 1st, 2007. She was found naked in a trash bag inside of a dumpster. She'd been shot in the back and strangled. She'd been found by an unhoused man who was looking for cans and he called authorities. She was found in the same alley as Bernita Sparks 20 years later. All of the victims were the same ethnicity and had similar ways that the bodies had been dumped, all in alleyways, near or inside dumpsters, and usually covered with other things found in the alley. All of the victims were sexually assaulted, and many of the victims seemed to have been snatched right off the streets. But maybe, like Nitra, they'd been offered rides home. Law enforcement in secret would start a dedicated task force after the 11th victim. They called it the 800 Task Force based on the room that they were using. It consisted of 6 detectives dedicated to the case and was overseen by the Robbery and Homicide Division. Not much is known about the investigation that happened in the 80s, nor how many times the police looked at the cases. It was released that sometime in the 80s they had collected DNA evidence and had preserved it, but DNA back then wasn't what it is today. Law enforcement in 1988 had been able to connect the ballistics from the victims. However, no gun was located, but they did determine that all the attacks came from the same gun. In 2008, the crimes were starting to get more headlines and the serial killer was given a name. LA Weekly coined the killer the Grim Sleeper. They gave him this name because of the apparent hiatus the killer took for 14 years between 1988 and 2002. With the detectives now able to connect all 11 victims through DNA or ballistics, they started to try and figure out who the suspect was, all the while still looking to see if other cases were connected. However, since the suspect wasn't in any of the federal or state databases, they were going to need to get creative. There wasn't much to go on other than the DNA evidence. The man who had called 911 had never given a description and had been anonymous, so they hadn't been able to check in with him. Anita's statement on what the suspect had looked like hadn't yielded any new leads, and she couldn't remember anything about him that helped the investigation. She couldn't remember any key identifiers. He just seemed like a normal man driving an average car. And until he had started attacking her, nothing had really stood out as odd. Everything during and after the attack was hazy. In 2009, police released not only the 911 call from the witness who saw Barbara Ware being dumped, but also the pictures of the van used in 1987. They also released an original composite sketch reported to have been from 21 years prior, probably given by Initra, as well as an age progress version of the sketch. Detectives were hoping that someone would recognize the suspect or that the caller from 1987 would come forward. In 2008, after having no success getting a hit in the databases for the DNA, police tried something a bit different. They searched DNA databases hoping to find a familial match, a cousin, an uncle, a child, or a parent. But in 2008, nothing came up. However, 2 years later, detectives would give the familial DNA another shot. This time in 2010, they got a hit. And based on how close the DNA was, this had to be a child of the suspect. The DNA that was a partial match was for Christopher Franklin, who'd been convicted of felony weapons possession charges in 2008, just a year after they had originally looked for DNA matches. In 2009, California started to mass catalog DNA from inmates as of January 1, 2009. Adults arrested for any felony offenses were subject to DNA collection. Chris' DNA had been collected in that initial sweep. Then police started to look at Christopher's family and quickly started to focus on his father, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. Police started to follow the man and look into his criminal record. Eventually, law enforcement put an undercover cop in as a waiter at a pizza place where Franklin would attend a birthday party. The undercover officer collected the plate, napkin, and pizza crust that Franklin had touched or eaten. They confirmed that the DNA from the pizza matched their unknown suspect and that Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was a serial killer that they'd been looking for 2 decades. He was brought in for questioning, and this is the video of his interrogation with detectives. In July 2010, Franklin was arrested outside of his home and charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Franklin pleaded not guilty and he was held without bail. When police searched his home, they found a gun with ballistics that matched the 2007 murder of Janissa Peters. They also found in Franklin's garage almost 2,000 photos of women and teenage girls, some nude and some looking unconscious or deceased. They also found a student ID for Aaliyah Marshall, who was 18 when she disappeared in 2006. They also found the Nevada driver's license for Rolnia Morris, who was 29 and last seen in 2005. 2 photos of Morris were also found in the collection. Law enforcement would release 180 photographs to the public in the hopes of identifying all of these women. Every time the photos were released, they got hundreds of phone calls. It was reported in 2016 that there were still 33 women who had yet to be identified. Some of the women were alive and well, some were missing, their bodies were never found or identified, and some were cold case murder victims who had never been connected to the 11 attacks that had been known. Police would discover that just days before the murder of Valerie McCovey, Franklin had been sentenced to 270 days in jail, which would have meant that he had been incarcerated at the time of her attack. He was sentenced 3 months before Valerie had been murdered, and he pleaded no contest. Once in jail, Franklin benefited from the LA overcrowded justice system, and they were releasing inmates early due to overcrowding. Franklin was released in May 2003, 2 months before he murdered Valerie and 4 months earlier than Franklin should have been released. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was born in 1952. He grew up in South Los Angeles, California, the same area where he targeted his victims. He was married and had 2 children, a son Christopher and an unnamed daughter. Reports say that his wife Sylvia was seen at court appearances up until his conviction. He lived in the house he grew up in when he was arrested. It has been said that his son still lives there. Franklin was described as a backyard mechanic who was good with cars and would often fix his neighbors' vehicles for cheap. He had previously worked as a garage attendant at a police station, but when he retired, he had worked as a sanitation worker or garbage collector at the time. When he was arrested, his neighbors would speak very highly of the man. Most couldn't believe that he had committed these acts, even years after his arrest. There had even been talk within the community that a police officer had committed the crimes and that he'd been framed. Lonnie Franklin had been in police custody at least 15 times over the years. He'd been convicted in the past of grand theft auto, receiving stolen property, battery, assault, and false imprisonment. He was never in jail for long and had been on probation several times. His last arrest was in 2007 before California voted on the mandatory DNA collection. In 1974, Franklin was 22 years old and was working as an army cook stationed in Germany. In April 1974, Franklin and 2 other men were dishonorably discharged when they were convicted of sexual assault. The men were found guilty of abducting a woman, a fellow female soldier. They pulled their car up to a woman named Ingrid. One of the women pulled her into the vehicle, holding a knife to her throat. And then they all took turns repeatedly sexually assaulting her. Ingrid would later testify that it lasted all night. She did have some cuts on her abdomen, but reported that she didn't fight as she had been afraid for her life. Ingrid also reported that it sounded like someone had started to take pictures of her before the men left. It's reported that she then asked for Franklin's phone number, which he gave her. That was how authorities found the men. Franklin had always said that the encounter had been consensual. All 3 men were convicted and sentenced to 3 years. Years in prison. Authorities couldn't find an explanation, but Franklin served less than a year for the sentence when the other 2 men served their entire sentence. A theory then came out that Franklin had never stopped killing, but it just wasn't in California. It was discovered that Franklin spent a considerable amount of time in Belize, which is where his wife was from. There remains an unsolved spree of killings in Belize that spanned from 1998 to 2002. The killer was dubbed the Belize Ripper. 5 girls between the ages of 8 and 14 were abducted, sexually assaulted, and stabbed to death. The killings caused a nationwide panic and saw that a national curfew was imposed for all minors. Schools in the region started hiring guards to ensure that none of the children were snatched, and these cases remain unsolved. Lonnie Franklin's trial started in February 16, 2016. The trial had been delayed several times due to various legal issues and the massive quantity of evidence in this case. Anita Washington testified at the trial. After telling her story, she was asked if the man in the courtroom was the man who attacked her in 1988. She pointed right at Lonnie and answered 100%. Ingrid, the victim in Germany, also testified at the trial about her encounter with Franklin in 1974, saying that to this day she still couldn't leave her home alone at night. It was reported that you could hear the jury's intake of breath when she testified. Prosecution also showed evidence of 4 other possible victims identified after his arrest. Sharon Alicia Dismuke, Inez Warren, Georgia Mae Thompson, who the task force, through investigation, believe were connected, and Relina Morris, whose body was never found, but pictures found in Franklin's possession made it appear that he had killed her. He was never charged with those crimes or convicted of them. In May 2016, after 3.5 months of trial, the jury took just over a day to deliberate and convicted Franklin of 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. In August 2016, 31 years after the death of his first victim, Franklin was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Franklin was sent to death row at California's San Quentin State Prison. And in March 2020, Franklin, at 67 years old, was found dead in his prison cell. An exact cause of death was not released. But in a statement, law enforcement said that it's likely that he died of natural causes and that there were no signs of trauma. Despite all of the evidence, pictures, DNA, and ballistics, Lonnie Franklin continued until the day he died, protesting that he was innocent. He never talked about the crimes, and he never gave the prosecution any information about any other crimes he may have committed. He took everything he knew to the grave. To this day, authorities still believe that there are many more victims. They have said that they believe the number to be at least 25 women that he killed and possibly one man. Authorities also believe that he most likely was not dormant or sleeping, as his nickname would suggest, for 14 years. So what do you think of the Grim Sleeper? Why did he get away with his crimes for so long? And do you think he stopped killing for 14 years? 3 chilling cases of wives who thought they had committed the perfect murder, but little did they know forensic science had other plans. On March 21, 2016, just after 9 p.m., Judith Nix in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, saying that she found her ex-husband dead in his room and that it looked like he had killed himself. Law enforcement would arrive at what they believed to be a suicide call. Judith would direct them to the primary bedroom, but it would quickly become evident that the suicide had been staged. The victim was 69-year-old Kenneth Nix, who was born in 1946 in Louisiana, the eldest of 6 children. In 1966, he had married for the first time, and he and his wife had 3 children and moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Ultimately, the couple would separate, and shortly after their separation, his first wife committed suicide while on the phone with Ken. Keith remarried 3 more times after, hoping to find a good mother figure for his 3 young kids. He met Judith in 1984. Judith was also divorced and was working as an accountant with 2 teenage daughters. She had been married before in the 60s, but it had ended quickly after she'd had her daughters. She was originally from Texas before moving to Tulsa. The 2 got married in Las Vegas in 1985. They shared a house together in Broken Arrow. Kenneth had a successful business called Inland Divers Incorporated that he had started in 1980. The couple is reported to have been happy for nearly 3 decades. They both worked for Inland Divers, where Ken did the tours and Judith ran the books. They both shared a love for the sport and a passion for the business, however their marriage would not last. Keith Nix told Oxygen Media, quote, "My father raised me and my brother to be on our own and not to be dependent on anyone, but Judith coddled her kids and financed her kids all the time. They had a problem and that caused turmoil between my father and Judy. Communication between the 2 was diminishing. In January 2011, Kenneth filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. He reportedly rescinded the case 16 days later. Then in August 2011, Judith filed for divorce, also citing irreconcilable differences. She also filed for a protective order against Ken. In seeking the protective order, she stated that she was in fear for her life and that her husband had a violent past, that she'd been experiencing abuse for 2 years. The protective order case was dismissed when both Judith and Kenneth failed to appear in court. They eventually did get divorced in September of 2011. However, during their divorce proceedings, law enforcement had responded to at least 3 domestic phone calls to the home before things had settled. But not all of those calls were made by Judith. Law enforcement would discover that Kenneth had also made calls reporting violent instances with his soon-to-be 4th ex-wife. However, after their divorce was settled, the couple still spent a considerable amount of time together, so it hadn't seemed that strange that Judith still had a key to Ken's house. The medical examiner attended the scene, and initially everything looked just as Judith had described. Judith had stated that she'd brought over supper for Ken and found him deceased in his bedroom. She said that he had a few medical conditions that caused him to experience chronic pain, and she said that Ken had told her that he had wanted to end his life because of the pain. Originally, she had told first responders that she had last seen Ken the day before when she brought him dinner the previous night, and she stated that his mental state was poor. But he didn't answer the phone. The first sign that the suicide had been staged was when police were moving the body and discovered that Ken had been shot twice in the head, which would have been a difficult feat. He also had bloodstains on his clothing. The bullet wounds were on his left temple, and he had blood on the right side of his sweater. The blood found on the clothing didn't match the position that he was found in, meaning that his body had been moved. The evidence wasn't matching Judith's story. The medical examiner would conclude that Kenneth had died closer to 7 a.m. that morning, 14 hours before Judith had made the phone call. Law enforcement then interviewed family members, which included Judith's daughters, Shelley and Angela. Shelley was interviewed first, and she had this big story about how she and Angela had never gotten along with Ken and that he was abusive. When asked to give her whereabouts for the day, she revealed that she'd been at Ken's house that morning around 11 a.m. and she spoke to her mother in the driveway. And this contradicted Judith's alibi. Just a day after the shooting on March 22nd, Judith Nix was arrested and charged with the murder of Ken Nix. Not only her, but both of her daughters, Shelley Davis Pearson and Angela Moore, were arrested on accessories after the fact. Then the Broken Arrow Police Department had received a phone call from law enforcement in Tulsa saying a man later identified as Angel's ex-husband Tony Moore had called. He said that he wanted to come forward and inform law enforcement that his ex-wife and sister-in-law had come over to his house around noon on March 21st and told him that Judith had shot Ken that morning. 3 women showed up to his house and were in his kitchen trying to plan out what to do next. How to get away with killing Ken. He said that the 3 women were very close, they always had been, and so their behavior didn't exactly surprise him, but he didn't want to be involved in their scheme, and he told Judith that she needed to turn herself in. After Angela and Shelley were arrested, Judith's story changed. When she first called 911, she said it was a suicide. But after being faced with new damning evidence, she changed her story. She then informed police that she'd gone to the house that morning and Ken had threatened her and said that she owed him money that he had spent on her daughters. She had reached for the gun he was holding, and in the struggle, it went off twice. However, this would be nearly impossible based on his wounds. She then told law enforcement that she'd called her daughters, saying that an accident had happened, that she was going to clean it up and maybe stage it as a suicide. Judith's daughters would eventually be released and were offered immunity deals if they agreed to testify against their mother. In August 2016, Judith's bond was set at $250,000 with the stipulations that Judith Nix had to turn in her passport, wear a GPS monitor, have a curfew, stay in Tulsa, have no guns and stay away from Ken Nix's family. And with that she was released on bond. Originally, her defense attorney had said that he was not sure she'd be able to get bond as all of her assets were being foreclosed on in litigation or being repossessed. Still, in September 2016, Judith managed to find the bond money and was released while awaiting trial. At the trial, the prosecution would theorize that Judith, who they discovered had been in extensive debt, had been approached by Ken. He was requesting money that he'd loaned Judith back, and she hadn't viewed that money as being a loan. In their divorce agreement, if Judith happened to survive Ken, she would get his house. The prosecution believed that this was the motive for staging the suicide in the hopes of gaining the home and getting out of debt. The defense would argue that Ken had been abusing Judith for years and that she was suffering from battered woman syndrome and she'd only been trying to defend herself, and shot Ken in self-defense. After a 5-day trial, the 80-year-old Judith Nix was found guilty of first-degree murder in March 2017 and a month later was sentenced to life in prison. Her sentencing hearing was the first time Judith spoke in court, telling Kenneth Nix's family that she was sorry. She'll be eligible for parole when she's 108 years old. Case number 2, Della Sartorius. On February 19, 1996, Dr. Daryl Sartorius, a heart surgeon in Cincinnati, Ohio, didn't show up for work and had not been answering his pages. His coworkers called law enforcement requesting that they do a welfare check. Police arrived at the home of Dr. and Mrs. Sartorius. His wife, Dante, answered the door and she said that she didn't know where he was. Police noted his car was still in the garage and they asked if they could take a look. They discovered Daryl in the basement on a couch with a gunshot wound to his head. The investigation started with them looking at the cause of death as suicide, but some of the evidence would make the death look more and more suspicious. The first piece of evidence was that they found a second bullet hole in the couch. Someone going to shoot themselves doesn't usually take a test shot that his wife didn't hear upstairs. Blood spatter evidence was also not what they expected from a suicide. In his hand was the gun, but there was a significant amount of blood underneath the gun on his palm, which the handle of the weapon should have blocked. There was also a swipe of blood spatter on the front of the couch and his legs, which couldn't have been made via the gunshot wound. They hypothesized that it appeared to have come from another person standing in front of Daryl. Because of the peculiar circumstances of the evidence, Dante was brought into the police department for questioning. There they tested her hands for gunshot residue and she tested positive. The medical examiner concluded on February 27th, after looking at all the evidence and the results of the gun residue tests from Dante and Daryl, that the victim had been murdered and that Daryl had not shot himself. The residue on the victim's head would indicate someone had shot him from behind. Also, police discovered that Dante had been the one to purchase the gun the day before Daryl was killed. And so Dante was arrested. Her own mother is even reported to have called the police to tell them that it couldn't have been a suicide and that her daughter had definitely killed Daryl. Police would discover that Dante had a checkered past and her name was actually Della. Della was from Cincinnati and her father had died when she was only 3. Her mother quickly remarried, and at 18, Della was a high school dropout who found herself pregnant and married to her first husband, Joe Hoffer. The two would soon divorce, and news outlets reported that she had struggled to support the child and herself, and the child ended up in foster care. Another reported that the child stayed with Joe Hoffer. It's not confirmed what happened to this child. However, Della, she married again and soon divorced in her early 20s. That was when she started going by the name Dante. She married a third time to a graphic artist named Grant Bassett. He would report that she would often threaten to kill him in their short 9-month-long marriage. Police would discover shortly after her divorce from Bassett that Della was convicted of threatening her next boyfriend with a gun. The boyfriend, stockbroker Lawrence Walker, would tell police that she told him that she was pregnant and threatened his life if she miscarried. Her fourth husband, computer consultant David Britton, reportedly told the news that he'd only survived the marriage because he hid the bullets for his gun. Then she met Dr. Daryl Sartorius when he was 55, a prominent heart surgeon in Cincinnati. Before marrying Dante, he had previously been married for 30 years and had 4 children with his first wife, and in 1994 the marriage ended. After his divorce, he was looking for a second chance at love when he went to a dating agency in the hopes of finding someone. This agency would be similar to an online dating site, where potential people could look at your profile in a book instead of online. Through the agency, he met a woman named Dante Britton, and the two hit it off. After only dating for 4 months, the two got married in March 1995, and he didn't know her real name was Della Hall or that she had children or had 4 ex-husbands. Daryl had no idea who he had just married. At first, they had seemed like a happy couple to everyone, but that didn't last. Daryl bought them a home in a nice neighborhood, and Della started racking up credit card bills. Even with Daryl making good money, it wasn't quite enough to fund the extravagant lifestyle that his new bride seemed to want to live. The two started fighting about money constantly. A work colleague would tell Daryl that he'd been talking about divorce. Investigators believe that this may have been Della's motive in killing her husband. She wouldn't get anything if they divorced, but she'd get almost $1 million if he died. What investigators believed happened was that Della had discovered Daryl had met with a divorce attorney. That was when she started putting things into motion. She bought a gun. She went down to the basement where Daryl was, came up behind him, and shot him in the head. Then took his hand and had him fire the gun into the couch. Then she just waited until the police arrived, pretending that she didn't know what happened, and tried to pass off his murder as a suicide. The media at the time would paint her as a black widow, someone who kills her partners. Newspapers would write, quote, Della Faye Hall Hofferbayer Bassett Britton Sartorius was the marrying kind, 5 times wed, each time selecting a man younger and wealthier than the last. 4 of the marriages ended in divorce, and some of her ex-husband claiming that they escaped with their lives. The 5th ended in a gunshot. During the 12-day trial, the prosecution would bring witness after witness explaining Della's violent past. They'd show evidence that the head wound could not have been self-inflicted. The defense would hold firm that Daryl was a very depressed middle-aged man who killed himself. Her ex-husbands and boyfriend would also attend the trial, meeting for the first time. The jury deliberated for only 5 hours before they convicted Della of murder. She was sentenced to a maximum of 23 years to life in prison. Della died in prison on November 20th, 2010 at the age of 60. The Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections informed the press that she had died of natural causes. She would have been eligible for parole in 2013. On June 16, 2022, at approximately 5 a.m., Susquehanna Township Police in Pennsylvania were called. The dispatcher said that the caller identified themselves as Evelyn Ciccarelli Henderson. Evelyn would tell the dispatcher that she'd found her husband dead on the back porch and that he killed himself by starting a fire and burning himself. Police would arrive at the home, and this was when things started to get peculiar. The dispatcher would note that something was very off about the caller. She was hesitant to answer questions. It was also noted that Evelyn had said she had heard her husband calling her name for help around 1 a.m. but didn't call 911 until hours later. When police arrived, they found the badly burned, naked body of 84-year-old Carmen Henderson on the back porch. Carmen Henderson was known in the community as he retired in '95 as a Dauphin County deputy sheriff, and the couple had previously owned a local limousine service. Evelyn Zigarelli Henderson, now 66, had also been a local political candidate, having started as a county clerk at 27 in 1983. She ran again in 2011 for the Democratic nomination for a clerk of courts in Dauphin County. She even wanted to change her name from her married name Henderson to Zigarelli Henderson. She told PennLive, quote, "Zigarelli is a powerful political name in western Pennsylvania." Evelyn and Carmen had been married for 30 years. They had met while Evelyn had been a car salesman and Carmen was still a deputy. The medical examiner at the scene would inspect Carmen's body and discover fly larvae in his mouth and nostrils, indicating that he'd been deceased for some time, up to 3 days. Police asked Evelyn about the timeline, and this was when her story would keep changing. At first, she told them that her husband had committed suicide. And then she said it was an accident, that Carmen had been on the back porch smoking a cigar and had accidentally set himself on fire. After police informed her that she had told the dispatcher that she'd heard him at 1 when he called out her name and she saw his pant leg on fire. She then picked up the phone to call 911 at approximately 1 a.m. and had just put the phone down without actually calling. She then remembered and called at 5 a.m. She never admitted to why she delayed in calling the police. Evidence would show that he had not been alive when set on fire. After Carmen had retired, him and Evelyn had started Henderson Limousine Service. Evelyn herself would admit that she spent all of the business profits on vacation homes, spa days, and other various self-indulgent activities. After this misuse of money, the business foreclosed. During the police interview, Evelyn would also admit that the couple had been in extensive debt. She'd taken out a second mortgage on the house and they had failed to pay it for some time. She said that she was going to be homeless as the house was going to be repossessed. Carmen had planned on going to live with his children from a previous marriage, but Evelyn was not welcome to join him. She would also admit that Carmen had a $10,000 life insurance policy of which she was the sole beneficiary. After the inconsistencies found at the scene and the fact that Evelyn would have financially benefited from his death, she was arrested and charged that day on June 16, 2022 with criminal homicide, aggravated arson, and arson. Fire inspection team would also conclude it was unlikely that the fire had been started by a cigar. Authorities never reported a cause of death for Carmen, and no new reports have been covered of the story since Evelyn was arrested. No details on whether or not she went to court or what pleas are available now. In these 3 cases, money and greed motivated these women to murder their spouses. And in all 3 cases, their stories were debunked by science.